Hi, this is Cece Doucette, and I want to welcome you all to episode 3 of Wireless Risks and Safer Technology Solutions. In episodes 1 and 2, we covered a lot of the science and why we need to start tuning in to the risks of microwave radiation that emits from all wireless sources and what we can do by choosing baby steps. Again, for you and I, over the devices that we have control, it's not hard. Just hardwire. Run this to the back of your router, get adapters, and then turn off the antennas in your own devices. So I am the Director of Massachusetts for Safe Technology, and I'm also the Education Services Director of the international nonprofit, where we help people learn about this issue and come up with solutions for safe technology. I want to extend my gratitude once again to WCCA TV in Worcester, Massachusetts, for inviting me into the studio to do this series with you. So we discussed that Dr. Martin Luther King taught us that when we have important changes come into our society, they come through 3 channels. 1, the public becomes informed and uses their voice to affect important change. 2, it goes through the courts. And 3, public policy ultimately catches up to, in this case, the science. So we left off starting to talk about legislation, and we do have a number of bills in Massachusetts. In future episodes, we hope we may be able to get some of the legislators to come on and talk to us about their bills. But I want to begin with a really amazing initiative that happened in 2019 in New Hampshire. So there's an award-winning film called Generation Zapped, and it's a really great tool to sit down with your loved ones, your colleagues, your friends who are going to think you're a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist when you start telling them, you wouldn't believe what I learned today, that wireless is harmful. Generation Zapped is an award-winning film. It won Best Documentary at the DC Independent Film Festival. It won Best Documentary at the Women's Independent Film Festival, and it was chosen as part of the United Nations Film Festival. And I was so honored to be asked to participate in the making of that film, simply because, unbeknownst to me, our schools became the first in the United States to even have a sign acknowledging that we need to be careful with wireless technology. So we did a screening at River Valley Charter School in just below the New Hampshire border in Massachusetts. And it was for a teacher at the school who had become ill and couldn't have the wireless access points in her classroom. And her principal was a really good man. And he said, of course, we're going to support you. And so she said, we could do an education session. And so she brought me in and we screened this film, Generation Zapped. And there was a pediatrician there, the teachers were there, parents in the community were there. So Generation Zapped is a really great way to have this conversation. And somebody in New Hampshire saw the invitation and came down and joined us. Well, that woman is Deb Hodgson. And Deb had been happily going about her life, her career, her family, and then started getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And nothing her doctors could test her for would show what was causing it. She started paying thousands of dollars out of pocket, and nothing the specialists were testing for could help her get well. So Deb started doing her own research, and she eventually discovered microwave sicknesses or electromagnetic illnesses. And so, it's hard when you figure this out because you're like, how can this be? It's invisible, it's all around us. But because she was crashing, she put her foot down and she took all the wireless out of her home. And again, it didn't mean she had no technology. She's using hardwired cabled connections with adapters. And within months, Deb's symptoms all started clearing up, from blood pressures to headaches to insomnia to nose, all these crazy symptoms that seemed unrelated. Well, we know they are microwave sickness symptoms. And again, this is so hard to have this conversation because her husband didn't want to believe it. Her 2 grown children didn't want to believe it. And you know what convinced them? The kids had given Mom a plant that pretty much sat in the kitchen doing nothing. And as soon as Deb turned off the wireless in the house, that plant grew 15 inches in 2 months. Because again, this radiation impacts every biological cell on the planet. So Deb invited me up to do a Generation Zap screening at her library in Stratham, New Hampshire. She reached out to her senator and her state rep to please join us. They had conflicts. But when Rep. Patrick Abrami was running for re-election, he knocked on her door and asked for the vote. She invited him in and shared with him what had happened to her and how she fixed it. Well, Rep. Abrami was an engineer, and our engineers have only been taught that you have to have heat from a device before there can be harm. And all of the FCC levels are set to that heat level. So the FCC allows industry to put out this much radiation, but the science that we discussed in episode 1 shows biological effects at hundreds of thousands of times below what the FCC has failed to bring up to date. So Rep. Abrami listened to her, and being the good public servant that he was, he went and he looked for the science. And he had this major wow moment, like, what are we doing? So Deb introduced me to Rep. Abrami. He had started writing a bill, and they jumped in his car from New Hampshire, came down to my home in Ashland, Massachusetts. We sat at my kitchen table, and we continued to educate on what this issue is. And we showed him the legal fine print that we covered in episode 1. We measured the radiation that we covered in episode 2. We showed him that world-leading insurance companies, Lloyd's of London, Swiss Re, AM Best, have long since recognized that this microwave radiation could be one of the biggest harms there are, and they put exclusions in their policies. They are not covering for damages. So that leaves our towns on the hook when they unwittingly allow this toxic infrastructure in at close range, like cell towers or small cells. So when the insurance industry says we're not touching this, that should be a giant red flag for us all. So Rep. Abrami beefed up his bill to say, why is that fine print in there? Why is the insurance industry walked away? Why does the FCC allow 100 times more radiation than certain other countries? Why do they ignore the non-thermal science? So again, it's not just about heat, it's disrupting our biological cells at the non-thermal level. And why is nobody looking at the cumulative effect of all of this microwave radiation from which we never get a break? So our bodies can't properly cell repair and regenerate during sleep if we don't get rid of the radiation. So Rep. Abrami introduced this bill, and on this journey, we've just had the privilege of connecting with so many amazing scientists, doctors, technologists, and we asked some of them to testify with us up in New Hampshire in 2019. We had the retired president of Microsoft Canada, whose name is Frank Clegg. And when Mr. Clegg was in the industry, he was mostly on the hardware end of things. But then when he retired, he's like, well, what do we really know about the wireless component? And he sought out a dozen of the world's leading experts on this and came back and said, our safety code 6 guidelines in Canada are not protective. America's FCC guidelines are not protective. And so, bless Frank Clegg, he flew in on his own time and dime and testified with us in New Hampshire. Dr. Paul Heroux, who used to work for industry, realized what was going on and probably took a huge pay cut to go into academia. And he has now, for many years, been with McGill University in their medical school, and he teaches electromagnetism and the biological effects. And he himself has created cancer in his lab using man-made radio frequency microwave radiation. So we testified, and citizens testified, and biologists, and we got this through the House Committee on Science, Tech, and Energy. It then went over to the Senate Committee on Health and Human Services, which was co-chaired by Dr. Tom Sherman, who was a co-sponsor of the bill, and he's a medical doctor, and they advanced the bill. And then it went to the Governor Sununu's pen, and he signed it into law that New Hampshire had to form a commission to investigate the health and environmental impact of today's wireless technology. They started with 5G, but once they got into their report findings, they realized it's not just 5G, it's every wireless transmission. So they spent a year, even during the pandemic, bringing in world-leading experts to provide information to them, and they did it the right way. They brought the industry to the table too. Beth Cooley, who used to work for the Cellular Telephone Industry Association, or CTIA, the wireless industry, she had a seat on that commission. Dave Juvet, who worked for the Business Association in New Hampshire, he represented industry. He had a seat, although sadly he very seldom came to the commission meetings. And so they had everybody's input. And at the end of the day, New Hampshire came up with the country's first independent investigative report on wireless technology. And they document the conflicts of interest that we discussed in our earlier episodes between the Food and Drug Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, and the wireless industry. They also made 15 recommendations for what we should be doing to transition away from this technology because it's not sustainable. We know that wireless equipment has to be replaced very quickly, whereas hardwired fiber optics to and through the premises is far more future-proof. You do have to give up a little bit of convenience when you're on the go, but if we all learn to do most of our technology use from a hardwired connection, then all the demands for capacity that the industry is selling now, they're saying, oh, we have to have 5G, we need more capacity, we need streaming, we need smart cities and superhighways. We don't need that. What we need is excellent technology connections through fiber optics to and through the premises, and then there will be enough capacity to be able to make a cell phone call for an emergency with the infrastructure we already have with the 3G and 4G antennas that are mounted out there. So New Hampshire recommends that we get our federal delegates on this and overturn that Section 704 of the Telecom Act of 1996 that the industry keeps using to tell our towns their hands are tied. Well, their hands are not tied. There is much that Congress left for our towns to empower themselves to be able to protect themselves and absolutely dictate where wireless infrastructure can go. But that's not what they've heard from industry. There are excellent attorneys who used to work for industry who realized what the game was, and they switched teams. Attorney Scott McCullough is the attorney who gave the oral arguments in the lawsuit from Children's Health Defense and the Environmental Health Trust. And he'll say, you may have one finger tied, but you've still got 9 other fingers to protect your community with. So we are so very grateful to our friends at Grassroots Environmental Education. They're a nonprofit that has done amazing work. They've won an award from the EPA for what they've done to, for example, take pesticides out of schoolyards. And they have come up with a project called Americans for Responsible Technology. And they have culled best practices from around the country, and they have a checklist so you can take it to your town and say, what does our zoning code say? Do we have any protections? Here's a checklist that we'd ought to have, and here is a sample code that we can adopt, or at least compare it to our current zoning code on wireless communication facilities and get it right. Most of our town attorneys are wonderful lawyers, but very, very few know where to look or know how to address the Telecom Act. They'll go and look and see, oh yeah, the industry says they're going to sue us if we don't allow them to have this application to put up another cell tower. And they go and see court cases that, yeah, the industry sued. So it scares our towns. What they don't see is all the towns who have updated their zoning code, and when the industry says we're going to sue, they lose, or it never goes to court to begin with because they have built protections in for the town. So our local town attorneys don't know that, and so all they see is we're going to get sued, so of course we must approve these applications. And that's simply not what our town should be doing. So there are attorneys like Andrew Campanelli, And he has helped with code all over the United States. He's taken more than 7,000 court cases. And if you take it to court before the cell tower goes up, he wins 70 to 80% of his court cases. But once those cell towers go up, boy, is it hard to get them taken down. But it does happen. So New Hampshire is saying, get our federal delegates to overturn that Section 704 of the Telecom Act, which leads our towns to think they have no say in public safety. So let's get rid of that. Let's get our federal delegates also to start working with the EPA again, because it was defunded when that Telecom Act got passed by industry in 1996. Get the EPA back on this, because there has been no environmental studies on this. The science is showing it's extraordinarily harmful to our pollinators, to our birds, our bees, our biomes, our trees. We can't keep radiating and expect to not see disappearing species by the score. So we have the science. We have a very robust body of science on the environmental effects. And then New Hampshire says, let's start transitioning our schools to hardwired technology. Let's start labeling everything that is transmitting radio frequency radiation. Let's start encouraging our medical community to get trained on this. Let's start encouraging the engineering community to start designing devices so that if you pick up an active device and you put it anywhere near your body, it's going to shut off so you can't fry yourself or those around you. So New Hampshire has come out with what is probably our country's greatest investigation on this. And in their final commission meeting, the industry had written their minority report. So in New Hampshire, if the majority is going one way, but there are some who disagree, they have the opportunity to create a minority report and include it inside the majority report. So there were 13 commission members. 10 of them went with the majority because they looked at the science. 3 of them did not. One of them, well, 2 of them were from industry, and one was Senator Gray. He must have his reasons for why he chose to go with the minority. But when we look at this, if you go to page 18 and read for 10 pages, they've basically given us a gift, and this is their playbook. It looks pretty cool. They've got some footnotes in here about, people who testify for them, and they talk about these agencies that look credible. But it's spin. It's half-truth and disinformation. It looks good on the surface, and that's how they get our towns and legislators to fall for this. But if you go to the meeting minutes for the final meeting in the back of the report, and you go to page 6 of the final meeting minutes, Senator Denise Ricciardi debunks much of what is in that minority report and fills out the balance of information that they failed to include. Dr. Paul Heroux served on the commission. He is the scientist from McGill University. And he said, please be reminded that the industry said they would give us studies showing that this is safe, and they never did, because there are no studies showing that this is safe, no credible peer-reviewed studies. So New Hampshire is now trying to introduce their recommendations and trying to get their legislature to enact these to start protecting the public. There is a new bill that has just been introduced in Maine this session, and it's by Representative Tracy Quint, who is a nurse, 25-year nurse, and she does trainings for the state. And her kids and her constituents were talking to her about wireless radiation. And so Rep. Quint has introduced a bill in Maine. I think it's LD 697. And that bill would also investigate the environmental impact to our birds, bees, and pollinators, and also the impact to school children. And when she testified a couple of weeks ago, she cautioned her colleagues to look at the non-industry funded science, because we know that industry, just like big tobacco did, they will fund their own research done under conditions that, of course, would show no harm. So it's critically important when we do the review, and as New Hampshire did, they looked at the science. They looked at these highly regarded peer-reviewed journals and found critically important information. So Tracy Quint reminded the Maine legislature to please bear in mind we should only be focusing on non-industry funded science. And she introduced to them what happened in Oregon. A few years back, at the same time that New Hampshire got their bill passed, Senator Lori Monez Anderson in Oregon also got a bill passed to get the Oregon Health Authority to look at this issue and then make a ruling as to what we should be doing about Wi-Fi in schools. So oftentimes a legislature will turn to their state universities for resources, because you could have postdoc candidates and others who would take this on as a project and do the research and then provide a report back. That's what Oregon did. They had the Oregon University system do the report, and Senator Monez Anderson's law said non-industry funded science. They did their report, they turned it over to the Oregon Health Authority, and somebody there apparently had conflicts of interest because a journalist did the Freedom of Information Act request, saw what the university had provided to the Oregon Health Authority, and then saw that all the credible information got crossed out. And what they published as their final report concluded, nothing to look at here. Keep with the radiation levels on our children in our schools. So industry has deep pockets, heavy influence, and it is our duty as citizens, our civic duty, to learn about this and do our very best to protect our citizens. And I mentioned that our friends at Grassroots Environmental Education already have a project to help you protect your towns. That's called Americans for Responsible Technology. And Patty and Doug have also created a new project that they launched around the time of the pandemic that's called Tech Safe Schools. So Patty and Doug are very peaceable. Nobody wants to be in anybody's face. We want to create an atmosphere that is calm and fact-based and supportive. So Patty and Doug have created Tech Safe Schools. They've got videos in there that include world-leading experts in science and medicine to teach our schools what this environmental toxin is. They have a webinar in there with world-leading or U.S.-leading attorneys to teach our schools that if you are radiating the children and the staff, you are taking on a huge, huge legal risk. And then most importantly, what to do about this. So they include a whole module on remediation. And again, it's not rocket science. You get a much faster, far more reliable, data secure, private connection simply using Ethernet. In our schools, the internet's already run to the building, it's run into the systems, and it goes to those wireless access points on the ceiling. Those wireless access points actually have Ethernet ports in them. So you can plug in Ethernet cables to each of the devices. You can get Ethernet switches so you can equip an entire classroom. You can get, this is a little 5-port switch. You can get a 30-port switch or a 28-port switch for your classroom, and then just plug everybody's device in, go into each device, and turn off the antennas. And then, as we showed in our second episode, it's critically important to measure to make sure that we've gotten all of the exposure. So our schools should be investing in radio frequency detection meters. They don't break the bank. This is the one that was recommended at the EMF medical conference for doctors to put on loan in their medical practices. It's the Safe and Sound Pro 2 broadband RF meter. It runs for about $400. There are others in that category too, so I'm not necessarily promoting a certain product. But for a school budget, it's not going to break the bank for the safety that it's going to bring to your students. So please, everybody, contact Tech Safe Schools. They have a packet of information they will send to your school administrators to help you open this critically important conversation to keep our kids safe, our teachers and staff safe, and to keep our schools out of legal risk. So for our towns, there's also a wonderful resource called Reinventing Wires, the Future of Landlines and Networks, because cell towers have no business being anywhere near where people are. Those big antennas that they're mounting on buildings and painting the same color of the building are extremely toxic. And now the industry is trying to force 5G or fifth generation small cell antennas into the curb inside our neighborhoods every 2 to 12 houses so they can have faster download speeds. None of us ever woke up and said we need faster download speeds. This is just their next layer of revenue stream. And they, by the way, are buying up the entertainment industry as they push all this streaming out. So Reinventing Wires tells us why investing in any more wireless infrastructure is a really bad idea. And here in Massachusetts, several towns right now, citizens have done a petition to put a warrant article on for the next town meeting vote to say we need our city council, board of selectmen to start writing letters to our legislators, to the municipal authorities, to the health authorities at the state level to say we need to do better for our towns. And others are saying until that FCC court order to address this issue is fulfilled, we do not consent to any more applications for any kind of wireless infrastructure in our community until the FCC completes their job. So there are things that you and I can be doing and should be doing, and I know it takes me hugely out of my comfort zone. I never imagined this is where I'd be spending my time. But when we realize what's at stake for our pollinators and our children and ourselves, then one by one we pluck up the courage to get others around us educated first. Do not go it alone. You're easily shut down. Get others educated first. Do a screening of Generation Zapped. Send people to our monthly webinars out at Massachusetts for safe technology, and we will help train everybody at once. And then let's together go to our towns and say, look what these other towns are doing. And in future episodes, I hope to bring in some special guests who have actually plucked up the courage and are doing these measures right now in their towns to safeguard their citizens, their children, and their pollinators. So thank you so very much for joining us for Safe Technology Solutions, and we hope that we'll be able to entertain you with a little more information in episodes to come with live interviews. Thank you, everybody. Have a tech-safe day.